In 1985, Herbie Hancock and Wynton Marsalis sat down for a joint interview that ended up being one of the most entertaining but also informative interviews about jazz that I've ever read. Despite being really good friends and having worked together in the past, the two of them had very different ideas about what constituted good jazz and bad music. The story actually starts about a year earlier at the 26th Annual Grammy Awards, where both Herbie Hancock and Wynton Marsalis had a good night. But before we get into that, a bit of background about the two players. Herbie Hancock is one of the legends of jazz in the last 50 years. He grew up playing classical piano but got into jazz during high school. Released a couple of fantastic albums when he was still very young, but also played with acts like Miles Davis. And then Herbie went on to do something a little bit differently once he left Miles's group. He pioneered funk fusion, especially with the Headhunters album in the 1970s. Wynton Marsalis was a lot younger than Hancock, and him, along with the Young Lions, who was this new breed of jazz players, were blowing up the 1980s jazz scene. He did earlier on, though, play in Herbie Hancock's band, so the two share some history. The Young Lions weren't really interested in fusion or funk or rock music. They really focused on bebop and hard bop, which were the predominant jazz styles of the 1950s and 60s. So back to February of 1984, where the 26th Annual Grammy Awards were occurring. Starting with Wynton, he performed that evening and he won 2 Grammy Awards, one for Best Solo Jazz Performance and for Best Solo Classical Performance. Herbie Hancock also performed on the night and won the Best R&B Performance for his song Rocket. Now, Rocket is not a jazz song by any means. It's a result of Herbie's experimentation with synthesizers and drum machines and a crossover into pop. Rocket is essentially a synthesized hip-hop pop record. It's worth noting that Rocket's music video was also really important because it was one of, along with Michael Jackson's Thriller, one of the first music videos by a black artist to get onto MTV. And immediately after that, black artists had a much easier time of getting onto MTV, which came to be probably the most important output for music in the 80s and 90s. Right, so back to Wynton, and his Grammy speech included a line that was a little controversial, to say the least. In accepting his Grammy, he thanked, quote, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Louis Armstrong, all of the guys who gave an art form to the American people that cannot be limited by enforced trends or bad taste. So the question was, asked by everyone immediately, were those bad tastes referring to Herbie Hancock with Rocket, or to Miles Davis, who had just put out a couple of funk records? Miles Davis certainly thought so. He was quoted, "He sounded to me like he's supposed to be the savior of jazz. Sometimes people speak as though someone asked them a question. Well, nobody asked him a question." Now, Wynton said later that he wasn't talking about Miles, he wasn't talking about Herbie Hancock when he made that comment, but Wynton's a smart guy, and he's also on the record saying that he likes drama, so it's pretty likely he knew that he was going to be ruffling some feathers. So jump ahead a year, and Hancock and Wynton Marsalis have sat down for a joint interview with Musician magazine. Very early in the interview, they do speak about the Grammys directly, and Herbie Hancock starts with this. "I have to congratulate you on that. You implied that there was good music and music that was in bad taste, and everyone wondered, what music is he referring to?" And Wynton's response, "The only statement I made was that we're trying to elevate pop music to the level of art. Not just in music, pop culture, pop anything. I have nothing against pop music, just understand what the music's about, because the purpose and the function of pop music is totally different from jazz." A little later in the interview, Marsalis explains what he means by the function of pop music. To me, what pop music is trying to do is totally different. It's really geared to a whole bass type of sexual thing. I listen to the radio, I know the tunes they have out now. It's low-level realizations of sex. And Hancock says, "It's not like that, Wynton. If it were, it would just stay the same. Why would the music change?" Marsalis, "Because they get new computers." So there's a different exchange later on where Hancock does flesh out his more open view of what music should be. He says, when we've got life, we've got music. Music can be manifest in many forms, and as long as they all have purpose, they shouldn't be pitted against each other as one being more important than the other. Now, the last quote that I'll read from the interview is the one that made me genuinely laugh the most. But keep in mind that these two have incredible respect for each other, and there's no hostility when they talk at each other in this kind of pointed way. Marsalis starts, "The purpose of pop music is to sell records that appeal to people on a level that they want to accept it on. If you put out a record and it doesn't sell, then your next response is, let's try and do this or that to make it sell." And the interviewer says, "That's terribly condescending towards pop." And Hancock says, "Why are we asking him about pop music? What does he know about pop music?" Wynton, "I know a lot about pop music." "No, you don't." "I played in pop at..." "Wynton, you don't. You think you know." So besides being incredibly entertaining, there's something interesting here. These two musicians are both masters of what they do. The authors actually note that in the introduction to the article. They say Marsalis is in a bind. While he doesn't respect what Hancock respects, he can't help but respect Hancock. I do want to defend Wynton, not so much on the points of his argument, but on his right to make it. Lots of opinions and arguments about jazz are controversial, but it's those debates that give jazz its importance and its meaning throughout history. And the fact that these two men can have such differing opinions on the music that they both love and spend their entire lives perfecting shows that art is and always will be subjective. It's never about trying to say who was right and wrong in retrospect, after the fact. Instead, the study of history should be about trying to understand how people felt about the art form while it was being created. Because what that lets us do is create the actual history of jazz, not some fictional history that we'd like for it to have had. To understand this story better, you should read the interview for yourself. You'll find it in an anthology called Keeping Time. I'll leave a link below. Marsalis and Hancock also spend a lot of time in the interview talking about the role of race in jazz. I didn't want to talk about that here because it's not my story to tell, and they do a really good job of it. If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe. I might do more in the future if you convince me it's worth it. They've got a frisbee, so all good. So just duck your head. Just put my helmet on.